The past year in the province of Alberta has seen convulsive change take place both politically and economically. In Edmonton, the Tory dynasty, which had lasted more than 4 decades, ended with a shocking majority government win by the NDP. In Calgary, oil's tanking sent the province's economy into a frightening tailspin. Author and journalist Bruce Dowbiggin has lived in Quebec, Ontario, and for the past 18 years in Alberta. And he joins us now to fill us in on a most unlikely story. It's great to see you again, my friend.
And you too.
Lovely to be back here. Should remind everybody, I think there were a lot of Mondays you used to come here in the old Studio 2 days.
We did.
You were on that sports
Stephen
panel.
Brunt and the boys. And girls.
Indeed. Don't want to forget Mary Ormsby there. What do you think Albertans were saying last year when they voted an NDP majority government?
I think the morning after they woke up and they said, "Holy Hannah," or something like that. Actually, 2 things. I think people, and I'm kind of proud of Alberta having elected Tories for 40 years, that they really did reach a point at which they said enough is enough with sloppiness, corruption, whatever from the Tory government. And it was a democratic exercise. Having said that, it was still only about 41% of the people voted for the NDP. So the vast majority of Albertans did not vote for the NDP. A lot of people were concerned about it. And then, of course, we had the 1-2 punch of the NDP election, plus the collapse of oil prices and natural gas prices in the world. And those 2 things gone together, there's a lot of people saying holy Hannah these days in Alberta. About 130 to 140,000 people in the oil patch have lost their job.
Get to more of that in a second. Yeah. I do want to find out, though, now that it's almost a year since the NDP won that majority government, how do you think people feel about it today?
Well, I think their approval rating is somewhere around 19 or 20% in Alberta. So, listen, for Ontario viewers, this is the Bob Rae interregnum. This is the situation where the NDP unfortunately gets their first crack at power. They're there when there's no money. The only place to look is the unions who've supported them for getting money, etc. So most people anticipate it's 4 years for the Notley government, and then we will see some form of conservative, progressive conservative, Wild Rose, a combination of the 2. They expect that'll be in 3.5 years.
Well, I guess one of the great debates about the Bob Rae government, since you've made that comparison, is how much of their misfortune was bad government and how much of it was bad times? And I ask the same question about this.
Well, again, I go back to the point. The timing stinks for them. It would be great if you're an NDPer and you get in when everyone is flush. And make no mistake about it, the last 10 years, Alberta has been flush. I mean, I know people who have 3 and 4 houses. They have recreation properties in Hawaii, etc. So if they didn't save over the last 10 years and they're poor now, it's their own fault. But there's been a lot of money. There's been a lot of wealth in the province of Alberta. And people also understand, though, that it's a cyclical thing. The people who were around for the National Energy Program, you remember in 1982 when Mr. Trudeau said, by the way, you're going to sell oil at our price, not the world price.
This is, we should say, the PM's father.
Yes.
The current PM's father for our younger
Yes,
viewers.
we do have to do that, don't
we?
Yes, and that was their idea. That was a huge blow to Alberta, and it promoted a lot of political unrest in Alberta. The NEP was the Firewall Alberta idea came out of that, and I think we're going to see something like that in the reaction of Albertans to what's happened in the East during this period when they're down, when they've been funding the whole country, when they've been putting money into equalization. The Denny Cordair thing in Montreal where he said no pipeline through there, that went over very poorly. People look at how Ontario is financing itself and they're going, why are we sending money there? I think you're going to see some new, sort of on the national scale, I think you're going to see some pushback from Alberta.
If we can continue this Bob Rae metaphor a little longer,
yeah.
It was different in Ontario in 1995 because, frankly, there was only one other party that ultimately was a Conservative party that could take on the Rae government, and that was Mike Harris's team. You got 2 Conservative parties in Alberta. So the center-right vote is split. And I wonder whether that represents a still potential opening for Notley to hang in there.
Well, it would, but there are a lot of meetings going on around conservative thinking people, and I mean small c conservative thinking people in Alberta right now about avoiding that. They know what can happen. These are the people who lived through the reform conservative split on the federal level. They do not want to do that, and they know what will happen if they try to do it again. So there's a lot of people who are getting together. How do we do this? One of the big points of disgust that led to the NDP being elected was the attempt to try to amalgamate the 2 parties when Jim Prentice was the new premier and they brought over the Wild Rose 9 or 10 people, including their leader. People in Alberta were disgusted by that. On every level, they said this is political shenanigans, this is manipulation, this isn't what we voted for. And it was one of the reasons why they punished both of those parties in the election. So they have to be very careful how they bring the parties together, but as I say to people out there, I said, look, I lived through the Bob Rae 4 years. I said, make sure you have Mike Harris, and you'll get 8 years after that.
Well, is Mike Harris out there, or the Alberta equivalent?
They haven't identified that woman or man yet. What they're looking for is somebody in their 40s, somebody they can grow with, somebody who has some national potential as well. That person hasn't been identified yet. There was some thought that maybe Stephen Harper, after a couple of years, might want to come back at the provincial level, but he said no. Jim Prentice is obviously out. So it's going to be a new generation Tory person or conservative person who comes on. Who that person is right now, you know, the problem has been we had a woman who led the Conservatives in Alberta who, if she had played her cards right, would probably be the next leader of the federal Conservative Party.
Is that Redford?
Yeah, Alison Redford. But of course, she messed everything up with you know, what people saw as waste in government, building an apartment for herself, taking flights to Mandela's funeral. A lot of people were disgusted by that.
The name I keep hearing is Jason Kenney. That
Yeah.
he had of all the Harper cabinet ministers, he's the one who seemed to have the most independence,
Yeah.
a lot of success with the files he touched, and might be the one guy who could bring those two fractious conservative parties together. Do you hear that too?
I think people are waiting to see whether Jason wants to make the move at the national level or not. I think most people feel he wants to investigate that. But even then, I think there is a kind of Tory fatigue about the old names surrounding Stephen Harper. I really do think they want to grow some new timber, and I think they are looking younger for someone. And obviously, if it was a woman or a visible minority as a Tory, that would be even to the better.
And the Liberals, I guess, in Alberta are just not an option provincially?
They're defunct. I mean, you know, they have a couple of ridings where they have popular MPs, but it's not an object. And the NDP Conservative, that is the reality. That is the schism in Alberta. That is the tension between the two. And there will be the NDP has all the left-wing, center-left votes in the province now, anyhow.
Let's talk about how this is not your grandpa's Alberta, if you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
humor me here for a second while I go through this. Justin Trudeau's Liberals won 4 seats in the last federal election. That's a 400% increase from what they had before. It's not a lot, but it's a beachhead. The mayor of Calgary is a Muslim.
Yeah.
The mayor of Edmonton is one of the most dynamic, young, kind of center-left mayors anywhere in the country. He's in his 30s. And of course, Edmonton's been nicknamed Redmonton for a long time. The last time I saw Preston Manning, he said to me, "You people in central Canada just don't get it. We're not the caricature of the, redneck hicks that you think we are." Is he right about that?
Absolutely. I mean, the Alberta I moved to in 1998 was still a place where the oil men would shove their hand out and shake your hand, and you knew that was a deal. That's how business was done. A lot of urban people have moved there. Obviously, the money has been, the economy has been so good. We've had people move at every strata to the city. Schooling, we're now, I think we sort of lead the movement in education in the country in terms of private schooling and charter schools, et cetera. All sorts of things have happened. The city of Calgary is probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% visible minority. And I think 25% of the people who live in the city of Calgary were not even born in Canada. So the idea of, it's all white people who are cowboys and go to the Stampede, that is over. And it's, again, it's reflected. The NDP just would not have been elected in the year I moved there, which was 98. It took the influx of a lot of urban people into the system for this to change. And it's changed irrevocably. And of course, Naheed Nenshi, who is the mayor, is the symbol of the changes in Alberta. And a lot of people playing the political game are wondering where he goes next, too. Does he have a national? Does he have a provincial profile? Calgary's getting a little too small for him with the kind of presence he puts out there. And Alberta would love for him to represent them on the national stage so people in Quebec could see it's not the people that they've hated all these years.
Can I have a little fun at your expense here?
Oh, you always do.
Do you find there's some kind of irony in the fact that as your province has moved further left, you have moved further right? You personally, ideologically?
I think I've become more like my dad. My dad was a small C conservative. I think that I always say a conservative or a liberal is just a conservative who hasn't been audited by the government yet. And I think that's been sort of my experience of encounters with government and encounters with authority over the years has made me more of a small C conservative. But more of I guess it's about responsibility. It's the old notion of a citizen of the state and what your responsibilities are. When I first moved to Alberta, and I'll give you a good example, we didn't have recycling come to the door. You took your recycling to a center. You participated, you did that. Now it's come to the door. Now we're kind of urbanized. And I know it sounds like a small thing, but it's a large thing in terms of your commitment as a citizen. What do you do to make your community better? And Albertans have always felt like it was your obligation to reach out and do those things as opposed to the government to supply them. That worm has changed a little bit. I don't think the province has moved that far to the right. The people I know, and I play golf
Far to the
with,
right or the left?
to the left, rather. The people I hang out with are still pretty center-right. I think, and there's 60% of them voted against the NDP in the last election. So I don't think that has changed. As I say, my perspective is about accountability, and I think have also come to write a lot about the media and the media's participation in how we view issues, et cetera, across the country. And I'm going to gild the lily here a bit for you. I just don't feel there's enough people who are playing it straight down the middle the way I always have felt you did. I've spent years trying to get you to take positions on things in private and public, and you're scrupulous about not doing it, which is what your job is. But too many of the people in our business are now partisan, and everybody feels, even the Daily Reporter feels he has to have opinions and stuff. Maybe they've asked him to do that, but I don't think it works anymore. And I really think the ideas of editors and people who are on desks who used to look at this stuff and say, wait a minute, you can't do that, those people are gone, and now it's too much of a free-for-all. So that's the kind of conservatism I guess I represent.
Gotcha. Let's talk about the economy.
Yeah.
How awful is it in Alberta right now?
It's terrible. It's terrible.
Do you feel it everywhere, every day?
Yeah.
You do, eh?
One of the sort of symbols every year, here's the stereotype, but one of the symbols of the economy and how good the economy is, every year for the Stampede, they have the Stampede chuck wagon races. And they sell the tarps, if you know the canvas things that go over top of them. They sell them for advertising every year. And they have an auction, it's a big social event, and people bid on it. And the prices this year are down about 25% on the canvases. And that's symbolic of people, the oil companies, all the corporate people who used to put money into the Stampede, which is such a high-profile thing. They're pulling their money back. They don't have the money. Somewhere, as I said earlier, 130 to 140,000 people have lost their jobs in the oil patch. I know friends of mine who haven't worked since the start of 2015. No work.
What do they do?
They're sitting at home hoping. They're hoping. The thing that has to happen for, I think, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit from where you're going, but the thing that has to happen is we have to have some certainty or some predictability about the oil price. Right now, it's around 40. That's not bad. If we knew it was going to be 40 for 2 years, people could plan, people could get back to work. But they're not sure if it's going to be 20 or 50 or whatever it is. It's bouncing around too much. So there's no predictability for it. And until we see that settle in, I don't think you're going to see a lot of the people put back to work. And I mean, a couple of symbols of what happened. The chairman of Canadian Resources, Murray Edwards, who's also an owner of the Calgary Flames, has relocated himself to London, England for tax purposes.
He has left Alberta.
He is, for tax purposes, apparently has left Alberta. And for a guy who's an owner of the NHL team in town to do something that way, but he's basically said, you know, to the new NDP government, enough taxes. I'm paying too much in taxes.
No sales tax though, still, right?
Well, I know, but now there's all these carbon taxes. They're adding other taxes. They're user fees, et cetera. And then when you add that into the changes in the Liberal government, the federal Liberal government's things, he said, enough's enough. I'm out of here. And I think that's a really significant move when you have somebody who's a pillar of the community taking that kind of a decision to take his money and his influence out of the country in protest. That's significant, not just for Alberta, but for the country.
We've watched Alberta, though, Bruce, you and I, for decades now, and it's always been boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. Does this feel different?
It's different because this boom went on for so long that there are young people around who don't remember the last bust. And the people who were around for the NEP in the early 80s, I think some of them are saying this is even worse now, but at least they have a memory of a $10 barrel or a $5 barrel and pulling in and austerity for 2 or 3 years. The current generation, a lot of whom moved there, had no experience of that. They thought it was going to be $150 barrels of oil forever. The other thing that gets lost in this, too, is don't forget the price of natural gas. In fact, for a city like Calgary, in fact, natural gas may be more important than the price of oil. And natural gas has been below $2 a gigajoule for a long time. And that is really hurting the city and the province a lot, too. So don't lose sight of both things working in tandem as they hurt the economy.
I can remember 30 and 40 and 45 years ago, Peter Lougheed, the former Premier of Alberta, saying we've got to diversify the economy of this province, or someday, when we can't rely on oil anymore, we're going to be in big trouble. Has that happened at all?
It has. I mean, there are lots of people who are still working. I mean, there's over 1 million people in Calgary now. There was, I think, about 800,000 when I arrived. As a distribution hub and other things, it's doing better. As a center for some industry and some research, it's doing better. Medical research, it's doing better. But yeah, it's still not as good as it could be. But here's the problem, Steve. For all of those years, basically Alberta and Saskatchewan were funding the federal government and funding transfer payments to Ontario and funding transfer payments to Quebec. There was so much money going through the system. It was kind of hard for the federal government to say, oh, you know what, you should diversify a bit more in Alberta. Everyone needed the money. If you're going to have the liberal kind of programs that this government has had in this province and that Quebec has had, some of the services that you provide here, you got to have money for it. And your own economies weren't producing enough of that money. $8 billion a year was going to Quebec every year. $8 billion, sometimes $9. That money's gone. So again, if you were talking about diversifying, it was hard to do when you were so important to everybody and the federal government had no interest in you doing more.
Okay, here, I'm going to get a little parochial on you here.
Go ahead.
You do know the province of Ontario basically supported Alberta for 140 years before it received a check from Alberta.
Why don't we get a violin and play? This is what all my Eastern friends say. You know what?
It happens to be accurate.
But in the time when they were supporting, I would say to my Quebec friends, in the time they were supporting Alberta, there was no in vitro fertilization. They weren't providing tons of services. The kind of money they were providing was for the most basic things to get Albertans through their lives. The kind of stuff that governments are involved in now that are being funded by the transfer payments are far different from anything that Alberta ever had at that time. We were, you know, when I say Alberta, I say we. The province of Alberta was not, you know, luxury. It was not spending on excessive things. It was real basic stuff it was spending on to get from day to day. So I think there's a huge difference between what Ontario supplied and what went the other way. And the other thing is we expect Ontario and Quebec to punch up to their weight class, and they're not doing that economically. I mean, Ontario and Quebec have not punched up to their weight class. People in the West are resentful of the fact that Ontario is now a net taker in Confederation a lot of the time. Quebec, they gave up on years ago. I mean, that's like a welfare case. They really resent that. And as I say, the anxiety around the oil crisis now is also producing, I would say, maybe a resumption of the firewall Alberta mentality about we're not sending money east. And, you know, Denny Cordair doesn't want our pipelines. Well, we're not going to send money east. And I think people are going to be more, especially if you get a more conservative government back in provincially, I think they're going to be more circumspect about how much money they send east.
How much of this angst is political? I mean, the Albertans have had the satisfaction of knowing that the Prime Minister of the country for the last decade was one of them. Now it's another Quebecer who's Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And you know what? Of all the sort of potential candidates to be the new leader of the Conservative Party, there aren't too many Albertans on that list either. Most of them are from central Canada.
Yeah. We'd like Brad Wall. We'd take a Saskatchewan. He doesn't have to be.
That'd be okay with you.
But your point is well taken.
They feel the political center of gravity moving back to the middle of the country.
Sure, and you know, one of the things that when Joe Clark went east from Alberta, they basically saw him as a vendu, as a guy who went
sellout.
Yeah, who went native. And they're going, when we send people east, they've got to be our guys. And to be honest with you, a lot of people in Calgary in particular, but Alberta in general, felt like Harper didn't do the mandate that they thought they were electing him to do. It's not dissimilar to what's happening in the United States with the Tea Party people. The Conservatives in Alberta felt that Stephen Harper was just playing it like a liberal for a long time. They didn't think he was aggressive enough on the Conservative side.
Isn't that funny? Because, I mean, obviously...
Oh, I know the perception here.
Completely the opposite.
That he was Attila the Hun with you know, cutting. But the people in Alberta said, no, that's not what he used to write about, and that's not what he used to talk about. So there will be some real apprehension about who that next person is. You know, I saw Jeffrey Simpson writing about someone from Quebec, etc. There'll be real apprehension in the West about somebody from the East running the Conservative Party in the future, unless he or she is a dyed-in-the-wool conservative.
Small c conservative.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's possible to have those people. I mean, a Mike Harris kind of person, he could be the leader of a Tory party that Alberta would support.
Let's, speaking of apprehension, let's finish up on this.
Yeah.
Is there real apprehension that the oil patch in Alberta is never going to come back?
Well, one of the big problems is that so many of the commitments from the multinationals who are in the oil patch, and particularly up in the oil sands, is that these are 20, 30-year commitments. And what's happening now is we're having plans that were made for 20 or 30 years of being abandoned. So it's not just, okay, oh, well, the price is back up, it's all like it used to be. They're going to have to ramp up a whole bunch of projects that have basically been abandoned, wells that have been abandoned, people who've been left by the wayside. They're going to have to do a lot of that sort of stuff just to get back to quote-unquote normal before they can start to grow again. So this isn't $50 barrel of oil or $60 barrel of oil, poof, it's all good.
Yeah.
It's different. And the commitments long-term, before somebody's going to make new 20, 30-year commitments to, we also have to know about some stability. And I'm sure you've talked about on your show, this whole thing is just a microchip away from all being mostly irrelevant. If somebody figures out a way to power things with a little microchip, as you know, everyone's trying to get there.
Forget fossil fuel altogether.
So it's tough to plan 20 years and 30 years in the future, taking money out of the oil sands if all of a sudden a little chip changes everything. And I didn't mention the coal business in Alberta, which is a huge business, has been really hurt too. That's another one.
You know, despite the fact you've lost all your Ontario street cred, we still like having you here anyway.
I like being here. I like seeing you too.
It's great to have you back, Bruce. Thanks so much. Bruce Dowbiggin.
I've enlightened people on us crazy people in the West.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.